Fear ends here. Doubt stops now. This is Zero Bend.
Woman, you are not imagining the unease you feel, and you are not being difficult or overly sensitive for noticing that something in this relationship does not sit right with your spirit. There are moments when everything appears calm on the surface, yet inside you sense a quiet resistance, a subtle tightening, a pause you cannot explain. And this is not fear speaking, but awareness awakening. God does not always warn through crisis or confrontation. Sometimes the warning arrives as a persistent lack of peace that refuses to leave. Even when logic tells you everything should be fine, you may find yourself replaying conversations, questioning your reactions, wondering why clarity feels just out of reach. And that is often the first indication that the relationship is demanding more from you than it is giving back in alignment. You have learned to be accommodating, to explain yourself, to adjust your expectations so that harmony can be maintained. But harmony that requires self-erasure is not balance, it is slow loss. When God alerts you to danger, it is rarely about what the other person is doing openly and more about what the connection is quietly undoing within you. There are relationships that do not appear harmful in obvious ways, yet over time, they weaken discernment, dull confidence, and blur boundaries until you no longer recognize the clarity you once carried. This is not accidental, and it is not random. You may notice that your energy changes after interactions, that your thoughts become heavier, that decisions feel harder, and that progress in other areas of life begins to stall without a clear reason. Scripture often speaks of wisdom as something that guards the heart, not because the heart is fragile, but because it directs life itself. When a relationship consistently pulls you out of alignment, wisdom does not argue or negotiate, it quietly alerts. This is why the warning feels gentle yet firm, present yet unforced. You might be telling yourself that patience will fix it, that understanding will eventually bridge the gap, that love should be able to endure confusion, but endurance was never meant to replace discernment. There is a difference between perseverance and self-betrayal, and God never asks you to sacrifice clarity in the name of connection. A relationship that requires you to constantly explain your worth, your vision, or your boundaries is not preparing you for growth, it is preparing you for exhaustion. Notice how often you feel the need to justify staying. Notice how often you silence your intuition to preserve comfort. These are not small details, they are signals. In many teachings, wisdom is described as crying out softly, not loudly, and only those who slow down long enough can hear it. The warning you are receiving is not urgent because it needs panic. It is steady because it needs obedience. You may feel torn between what you sense and what you hope, between what you know and what you wish could be different. This internal division is not meant to be resolved by compromise, but by alignment. God's guidance often disrupts attachment before it restores direction. That is why letting go feels heavier than holding on, even when holding on is slowly draining you. Every now and then, pause and notice how your body responds when you think about the future of this relationship. There is information there that the mind has not yet processed. Peace is not something you force yourself into. It is something that remains when truth is present. If peace keeps leaving, something else is speaking. You are not being warned because you are weak, but because you are positioned for something that requires clarity, strength, and wholeness. Relationships that harm do not always do so through betrayal or conflict. Sometimes they harm by delaying you, by keeping you emotionally occupied, by normalizing confusion until it feels familiar. God's restraint is an act of care, not control. You do not need more time to see clearly. You need more honesty to admit what you already see. Awareness is not meant to accuse, only to illuminate. And illumination rarely demands immediate action, but it always demands attention. So you stay still for a moment, you listen without rushing, and you allow the warning to remain present long enough to do its work, because clarity does not arrive all at once. It unfolds as you remain willing to see what has been quietly revealed. Discernment rarely announces itself with noise or urgency. More often, it settles in as a gentle but persistent discomfort that you cannot quite shake. It shows up when nothing is technically wrong, yet something inside you refuses to relax. You may laugh, converse, and participate as usual, but beneath the surface, the is a steady awareness that something is misaligned. This discomfort does not come from suspicion or insecurity. It comes from perception. It is the part of you that notices when words and intentions do not fully agree, when actions require interpretation instead of clarity, and when peace must be talked into existence rather than naturally present. Many women are taught to distrust this quiet signal because it lacks evidence and cannot be defended easily. You may tell yourself that you are overthinking, that you are too sensitive, or that you should be grateful things are not worse. But discernment is not fear-based. It does not rush or accuse. It simply observes and registers truth before the mind catches up. This is why the discomfort feels calm yet firm, subtle yet unyielding. It does not intensify when ignored. It deepens. God often communicates through this internal restraint because it respects your agency. Instead of forcing awareness through pain, he allows clarity to surface through unease. In Scripture, wisdom is often associated with understanding that precedes consequence. This discomfort is that understanding arriving early. It is not meant to alarm you, but to slow you down, to keep you attentive, to prevent emotional momentum from carrying you into something your spirit has already evaluated. When you learn to honor this signal, you stop requiring proof before protecting yourself. You recognize that clarity does not always come with explanations, and that discernment is less about knowing what will happen and more about recognizing what is already being revealed beneath the surface of what appears acceptable. Emotional familiarity has a way of creating comfort that feels safe even when it is misaligned. When someone feels known, accessible, or easy to be around, the connection can quickly be mistaken for compatibility. You may share history, routines, humor, or emotional patterns that feel reassuring simply because they are predictable. This familiarity can quiet your discernment, not because the relationship is right, but because it has become normal. What feels normal does not always nourish what is purposeful. Spiritual incompatibility rarely announces itself through conflict. It shows up through different values operating under the surface, different priorities shaping decisions, and different responses to growth and responsibility. You may notice that when you speak about direction, vision, or inner conviction, the conversation subtly shifts or loses energy. There is no argument, no resistance that can be named, yet there is also no resonance. This absence is easy to overlook when emotional closeness is present, because closeness can imitate alignment without requiring it. In many cases, emotional familiarity forms through shared vulnerability, but vulnerability alone does not equal spiritual partnership. You can be emotionally open with someone who does not have the capacity to steward what you carry. When that happens, you may begin to adjust your language, soften your truth, or delay obedience to maintain connection. This adjustment is often unconscious, and it feels small at first, but over time it creates internal tension. The relationship remains emotionally comfortable while your spirit becomes increasingly constrained. Scripture often reflects the idea of walking together requiring agreement, not in preference, but in direction. Agreement and direction cannot be sustained by affection alone. When two people are not moving toward the same inner values, one will eventually slow down or compromise to preserve the bond. Emotional familiarity can make that compromise feel reasonable, even loving, until you realize that the cost has been clarity. You begin to sense that staying requires more effort than leaving, not because of conflict, but because your inner alignment is quietly being negotiated away. A relationship can feel peaceful while slowly eroding purpose because peace and alignment are not the same thing. Peace, when defined only as the absence of conflict, can exist even in spaces that are quietly diminishing you. There may be no arguments, no overt tension, and no obvious harm, yet something essential begins to dull. You continue functioning, but momentum fades. Goals feel postponed rather than pursued, and clarity feels optional rather than necessary. This kind of peace is comfortable, but it is not activating. When a relationship is misaligned with purpose, it does not usually pressure you to abandon your calling outright. Instead, it encourages delay. You may tell yourself that there will be time later, that now is not the right season, that once things stabilize, you will return to what matters. These justifications feel reasonable because they are subtle. Purpose erosion does not demand rebellion. It only requires distraction and emotional investment that absorbs the energy meant for growth. You may notice that you think less expansively about your future, not because you have changed, but because the environment no longer reinforces forward movement. Conversations revolve around maintenance rather than direction, comfort rather than calling. Over time, your sense of urgency softens, and your inner drive becomes negotiable. This is not a failure of discipline. It is a response to influence. Human beings naturally adjust to the expectations and pace of the relationships they prioritize. In many spiritual teachings, purpose is described as something that must be guarded because it can be diluted without being attacked. A relationship that feels peaceful yet unproductive can slowly redefine your standards for progress. You may begin measuring life by emotional stability instead of meaningful impact. Nothing feels wrong enough to leave, yet nothing feels right enough to grow. This is the danger of mistaking calm for confirmation. When purpose is eroding, the warning does not come as pain, but as stagnation. You are not distressed, B. You are not advancing. Time passes, seasons shift, and you realize that while the relationship remained consistent, your vision quietly narrowed. The loss is not dramatic, which makes it harder to identify, but its effects accumulate in missed opportunities, delayed obedience, and a growing sense that something important is waiting for your attention elsewhere. Ignoring inner restraint often feels harmless at first because nothing immediately breaks when you override it. You make a choice, the relationship continues, and life appears unchanged on the surface. This creates the illusion that the restraint was unnecessary or exaggerated. But inner restraint is not designed to punish you for disobedience. It is designed to protect you from delay. When it is ignored, clarity does not disappear. It simply moves further down the road, often arriving after more emotional investment has been made. Delayed clarity is costly because it requires unlearning what you allowed yourself to normally. Each time you silence that internal pause, you reinforce the habit of negotiating with your intuition. Over time, this weakens your ability to trust yourself, not because your discernment was wrong, but because you trained yourself to override it. The result is prolonged confusion. You begin revisiting decisions repeatedly, seeking external confirmation for what you once knew internally. And this cycle extends the duration of discomfort rather than resolving it. Pain becomes prolonged, not because the situation worsens dramatically, but because resolution is postponed. You remain in a space that requires constant emotional management. You explain behaviors that do not sit well with you, reinterpret words that felt dismissive, and tolerate patterns that create quiet strain. Each adjustment feels small, but collectively they lengthen the time it takes to reach truth. What could have been a brief moment of clarity becomes a long season of emotional labor. In spiritual principle, obed, Eance is often linked with timing. When timing is missed, the lesson does not vanish. It simply repeats at a higher cost. Ignoring restraint does not mean God withdraws guidance. It means the guidance must now operate within the consequences of extended involvement. Clarity still comes, but it comes later, and later often includes grief for time spent, energy depleted, and growth delayed. This is why the warning feels insistent yet calm. It is not about condemning the choice you are considering. It is about shortening the distance between awareness and action. Inner restraint is an invitation to choose clarity early, before attachment deepens and before release requires more strength than it should have ever demanded. Not every connection is meant to be confronted, discussed, or corrected. Some relationships are not assigned to transformation through dialogue, but to discernment through distance. When you assume that every issue requires a conversation, you may unintentionally prolong what was meant to end quietly. There are moments when explanation only creates more entanglement, more emotional investment, and more opportunity for confusion. Release in these cases is not avoidance, it is alignment. You may feel pressure to justify your decision to step back, as though clarity must always be defended with reasons that others understand. But some awareness is personal, and some instructions are internal. God does not always authorize you to convince. Sometimes He only authorizes you to obey. When a relationship has reached the point where continued engagement requires you to override your inner knowing, confrontation can become a form of self-betrayal rather than resolution. There are connections that thrive on discussion and repair, and there are others that survive on emotional access. When emotional access is removed, the relationship naturally loses its grip. This is why distance can reveal truth faster than conversation. Without constant interaction, you be able to observe how much of the bond was sustained by habit rather than substance. Silence, in this context, becomes informative rather than punitive. Scripture often shows moments where separation preceded clarity, not because communication failed, but because proximity distorted judgment. Distance allows discernment to recalibrate. It gives your nervous system space to settle and your spirit room to speak without interruption. In that space, what was confusing becomes clear, and what felt heavy begins to lift without explanation. Release does not require animosity or finality. It requires honesty. You do not need to burn bridges to stop crossing them. Some relationships end not with conflict, but with quiet withdrawal, not because there is no care, but because care without alignment becomes costly. When release is appropriate, peace does not come from resolving every question, but from no longer participating in what consistently unsettles your inner clarity. Patterns of confuse. Ion are not signs that you need to try harder. They are indicators that something is fundamentally misaligned. Confusion that appears occasionally can be part of growth, but confusion that repeats itself without resolution is information. When the same questions resurface, when the same doubts return despite time, effort, and conversation, it is no longer a test of patience, but a signal of incompatibility. Endurance is often celebrated, but endurance without progress slowly becomes self-neglect. You may find yourself cycling through hope and uncertainty, feeling clear one moment and unsettled the next. Each cycle promises understanding, yet the outcome remains the same. This repetition can quietly erode confidence because you begin to doubt your ability to discern truth. The issue, however, is not your discernment. It is the environment. Some relational dynamics generate ambiguity by design, not through intention, but through inconsistency. Inconsistency keeps you mentally engaged, emotionally invested, and perpetually waiting. When confusion becomes a pattern, it drains energy that could be used for clarity and growth. You spend time processing, analyzing, and revisiting what should have stabilized long ago. This mental labor feels like effort toward resolution, but in reality, it is maintenance of dysfunction. Growth produces questions that lead to understanding. Misalignment produces questions that lead back to themselves. In spiritual principle, wisdom is often associated with light, not complexity. When something is right, it may be challenging, but it is not perpetually unclear. Persistent confusion is not a sign that you need more information. It is a sign that you need more honesty. Continuing to endure confusion in the name of loyalty or patience can delay the clarity that obedience would bring. Tests are designed to reveal strength and maturity, not to keep you stuck in uncertainty. When a situation remains confusing despite sincere effort, it is not refining you, it is depleting you. Recognizing the difference requires courage because it means releasing the belief that endurance alone will produce alignment. Some patterns are not meant to be solved through perseverance, but acknowledged as indicators that something must change for clarity to return. God's warnings are protective by nature, not punitive in intent. They are not designed to restrict your joy or limit your options, but to preserve what is already being cultivated within you. When a warning arises, it is often misunderstood as rejection or loss, especially when it involves a relationship that feels meaningful. Yet protection does not always feel comforting in the moment because it interrupts attachment before attachment can fully justify itself. The discomfort of being warned is not evidence of harm, it is evidence of care. Many people associate divine correction with consequence, assuming that warning only follows failure. In reality, warning often precedes damage. It arrives while options are still available and before emotional investment becomes irreversible. This is why the instruction feels preventative rather than reactive. God does not wait for you to be wounded to speak. He speaks so that wounding can be avoided altogether. The resistance you feel toward the warning usually comes from what it threatens to remove, not from what it intends to protect. When a warning is misunderstood as punishment, you may try to reason with it, delay it, or reinterpret it to preserve comfort. But protection does not negotiate. It remains steady, returning again and again because its purpose is preservation, not persuasion. In Scripture, protection is often framed as guidance that redirects rather than disciplines. It changes the path so the danger is never encountered, not so that strength can be proven through survival. Understanding the protective nature of warning reframes obedience. Obedience is no longer about fear of consequence, but trust in intention. You begin to see that restraint is not denial, but direction. What feels like limitation is often precision, narrowing your focus so that energy is not wasted on what will eventually drain you. A protective warning may feel inconvenient, especially when the relationship has not yet produced visible harm. But prevention rarely feels urgent until hindsight arrives. God's care is revealed not only in what He allows, but in what He quietly blocks. The warning you receive is not an accusation against your judgment. It is an intervention on behalf of your future clarity, stability, and wholeness. Love that requires you to diminish yourself does not begin by asking you to disappear. It begins by asking you to adjust. At first, the adjustments feel reasonable. You soften your opinions to keep peace. You delay your needs to avoid tension, and you explain yourself in ways that make others comfortable. None of these actions seem harmful on their own, but over time they create a pattern where your presence becomes conditional. You are accepted as long as you are manageable, agreeable, and easy to engage. This form of love is subtle because it does not openly reject you. Instead, it rewards silence and compliance. When you are quieter, things feel smoother. When you express conviction, the atmosphere shifts. You begin learning, often unconsciously, which parts of yourself are welcome and which parts create discomfort. This learning shapes behavior. You do not stop being yourself all at once. You edit yourself in pieces. Spiritual alignment never requires self-erasure. In biblical PR, insightful, love is often described as something that builds, strengthens, and clarifies identity. When a relationship consistently asks you to shrink your voice, minimize your vision, or downplay your growth, it is operating in opposition to that principle. You may feel close, connected, and even supported in certain areas, yet still sense that something essential must be muted for the connection to continue. Diminishment is exhausting because it requires constant monitoring of your expression. You think before you speak, you measure before you act, and you manage reactions instead of living freely. Over time, this creates inner tension. You may feel grateful for the relationship and resentful at the same time, supported yet constrained. This contradiction is not confusion, it is information. Love that is aligned does not fear your fullness. It does not require you to choose between connection and authenticity. When you begin to notice that staying means becoming smaller, it is not because you are demanding too much, but because the relationship lacks the capacity to hold who you are becoming. Repeated emotional exhaustion is not a badge of honor, and it is not proof of commitment. When a relationship consistently leaves you drained, it is revealing something about its structure. Exhaustion that comes from meaningful labor eventually produces growth, but exhaustion that comes from emotional management produces depletion. If you find yourself needing extended recovery after simple interactions, that fatigue is communicating more truth than words ever could. Sacrifice is often misunderstood as enduring what diminishes you. True sacrifice in spiritual principle is purposeful and aligned. It strengthens rather than weakens the one offering it. Emotional exhaustion, on the other hand, quietly erodes clarity. You begin approaching the relationship already tired, already bracing for what may be required of you. This anticipation alone consumes energy before anything then happens. Over time, this creates a cycle where your baseline becomes fatigue. You may explain this exhaustion by telling yourself that relationships require work, that all connections have challenges, and that perseverance is a virtue. While effort is part of any meaningful bond, effort should not feel like constant emotional regulation. When you are repeatedly responsible for stabilizing moods, clarifying intentions, or preventing misunderstandings, the relationship becomes labor-intensive rather than life-giving. In many spiritual teachings, peace is described as something that guards the inner life. Exhaustion, especially when it is repetitive, signals that peace is being breached. This does not mean the other person is intentionally causing harm. It means the dynamic requires more energy than it returns. Over time, this imbalance affects your capacity to function fully in other areas of life. Creativity dulls, patience shortens, and enthusiasm fades. Sacrifice that aligns with purpose may stretch you, but it does not leave you empty. When exhaustion becomes the norm rather than the exception, it is no longer a temporary cost, it is a warning. Your spirit recognizes the unsustainability before your mind accepts it. Ignoring that signal in the name of loyalty does not deepen love. It delays the moment when honesty demands change.